2017 Finsbury Park terror attack, Starmer called it a terror attack before terrorism charges had been announced. Keir Starmer also did the same in the case of the London Bridge attack in 2017 and the Plymouth attack in 2019. And of course, after Southport, he had no problem at all in deriding many people in this country as far-right thugs before they went to court and had their cases heard. Yesterday, he appealed to contempt of court laws for not releasing the information about Southport earlier. Check it out.
Are not just my choices, though it is a choice I would make. It is also the law of the land. That is why I couldn't disclose the details. It's why others couldn't disclose the details. It's why all of you as journalists couldn't disclose the details, because the same laws applied to you just as they applied to me. And it's really important that we make that clear. But the purpose of the rule is to protect the justice that the families and the victims are entitled to.
Have you ever witnessed a leader being booed by his own supporters? That's precisely what happened to Starmer in Southport. The man who was meant to rescue the Labour Party confronted a harsh reality. From Brexit to praising Trump's actions in Gaza, Starmer left his base in shock, asking, "Who are you, and what have you done to our party?" He arrived in Southport likely expecting a warm reception. After all, he is the leader of the Labour Party, right? But the reality was a stark surprise. The moment he began to speak, the atmosphere in the room shifted dramatically. People started shifting uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging glances and questioning, "Is this guy for real?" The crowd's response was unmistakably a blend of disbelief and disappointment.
But if it applies to Southport, why didn't this apply to 3 other terror attacks, as well as those protests? We're now, of course, hearing reports that CPS pressured Merseyside police not to release details about the suspect. But just to top it all off, the government now wants you to believe that this was a case of knife purchase laws not being strong enough. You may remember when Sir David Amess was murdered by an Islamist terrorist, parliamentarians tried to make the issue about online abuse. Let's just be nice to one another. Well, the same thing is happening now. The government has fast-tracked tighter restrictions on online knife sales for under 18s, as if Amazon was to blame for Southport. Writing in The Sun today, the Prime Minister called Axel Rudakabana a 2-click killer. But the fact of the matter is that the system, the state, failed the victims of Southport, much like the state failed the victims of Pakistani rape gangs.
But do you know what was the most disappointing part? Starmer appeared genuinely taken aback. It was as if he couldn't fathom that his own supporters had turned against him so suddenly. It's almost tragic. Almost, because, let's face it, this is entirely his doing. He seems to have forgotten the fundamental rule for any politician to understand his audience. And, oh boy, did he miss the mark in Southport. The entire event was a total disaster from start to finish. It felt like a performance that made you question how someone could rise so high in politics only to fall so dramatically. Starmer walked in believing he was the star of the show, but he left looking more like the target of a failed joke. Remember when Starmer mentioned a second referendum? That was merely a fleeting moment.
Labour are promising a much better Brexit deal with the EU if the party gets into power, according to new claims from Keir Starmer. Starmer told the FT that almost everyone recognises that the deal that Johnson struck is not a good deal. It's far too thin. As we go into 2025, we'll attempt to get a much better deal for the UK, with him later saying that he thinks we can have a closer trading relationship with the EU as well. Now, the existing deal only came into force in 2021, but it is due for a review in 2025, although it's unclear whether the EU would be willing to make such major changes. However, Starmer also reiterated Labour's position that they wouldn't be taking the UK back into the EU, customs union, or single market. Nevertheless, Starmer's opponents have jumped on his comments, including the recent proposal to strike a migration deal with the EU.
In 2016, he passionately defended the idea of remaining in the EU, as if his very life depended on it, insisting on a public vote regarding the final deal. Yet in Southport, he suddenly shifted his stance completely. It was as if he had forgotten everything he had previously stood for. In Southport, Starmer declared that the Labour Party needs to abandon Brexit. Can you believe that? The crowd was visibly displeased, and there was palpable anger in the room. You might think he was attempting to win over voters who supported Britain's exit from the EU, but in doing so, he is alienating his own base. The Labour Party, which has been a staunch advocate for remaining in the EU, was outraged. It feels as though Starmer has betrayed them, and what's worse is that he doesn't even seem to recognize it.
Now you, the British people, are being gaslit. You are being lied to. While the people always sensed there was something unusual about the Southport atrocities ever since that fateful day, the authorities have hid behind legal processes and bureaucracies. Yesterday, Keir Starmer admitted that he knew the details about Axel Ruda-Cabana's background long before they came out. Check out this clip.
Yes, I knew the details as they were emerging. That is the usual practice in a case such as this. But you know and I know that it would not have been right to disclose those details.
But this is not consistent with Keir Starmer's previous actions during the...
I've witnessed several Labour speeches in Southport. Jeremy Corbyn, the crowd absolutely loved him. They hung on to his every word. But Starmer? It felt like watching a stand-up comedian who just can't get a laugh. You know that moment when a comedian tells a joke and instead of laughter, there's just an awkward silence? That was Starmer's speech. Meanwhile, the Labour Party members looked like they wished they could disappear into the ground. He began discussing his economic policy, believing he was sharing profound insights. But to the audience, it sounded like he was speaking a completely different language. The disconnect was glaring, and people appeared more bewildered than impressed. And then it happened, the first loud whistle. It was as if a dam had burst. Starmer was explaining how his economic plan would save the country, and from that point on, chaos erupted. The atmosphere shifted rapidly from uncomfortable to outright hostile. You could almost feel the disappointment radiating from the audience.
One of my biggest criticisms of the Conservatives since Brexit was finally delivered is we haven't really diverged at all, have we?
No, we haven't, but we have got the ability to do it. Now, let's look at what Keir Starmer actually said himself in his manifesto about what should happen with the European Union. He said every single part of the Brexit deal needs renegotiation, whether that's free movement, whether that's joining the European army, whatever it is. His own manifesto says he is going to renegotiate every single part of the Brexit deal. And do not forget that deal, conveniently enough for him, comes up for review in 2026. And what this is, I'm sorry, Russell, but, you know, what this is softening the British public up with nice things. Of course, we'll want our kids to be able to go and study in Spain and Portugal and wherever else it may be. In Germany. It is softening the British public up. He and his civil service chums know they've got a year to work on us for, ultimately, in my view, a Brexit betrayal in 2026.
During his speech in Southport, he was interrupted at least 5 times while discussing Brexit. 5 times. It was complete chaos. Each time, he wore a look of disbelief, genuinely unable to grasp why his own supporters had turned against him. But Starmer isn't the only one in the Labour Party shifting his stance on Brexit. The party is facing significant backlash on social media, which could have serious implications for the upcoming election. The polling stations that the Labour Party has traditionally relied on are slipping away from them. If you're a committed Conservative, why would you support a party that essentially asks you to overlook one of the most pressing political issues of our time?
Labour are rattled.
Yeah.
They're rattled.
They're scared.
Streeting is rattled.
They're going down. They're not popular. I mean, this is the worst start for any government. I think Keir Starmer is the worst ever Prime Minister, and it shows in all the polls. His popularity has sunk.
Akin says Khan wouldn't work with reform to look at employing more police to tackle knife crime, which predominantly affects black youths in London. That's how much he cares. So that was what it was. So instead of dealing with the issue and saying, you know, we all need to work together, this politicking comes into play once again.
Yeah, I think it's a bad characteristic to be stubborn in politics. I really do. I think sometimes you need to deal with a cross-party approach. But just to be so principled, I think it's a misguided principle, but just to be so principled to say, reform, I don't want anything to do with it. I think that's so counterproductive.
Well, it's actually pathetic, and it's not what he should be saying or doing at all. But I'm afraid that man, for me, another one that I think is an absolutely appalling person.
We're discussing key constituencies that have long been Labour strongholds and are now facing potential threats. This shift seems to stem from Starmer's inability to take a clear stance on Brexit. But what's really driving this sudden change? Is it merely Starmer's attempt to cater to everyone at once? Or is there something more significant happening behind the scenes? Just when you think Starmer can't possibly make his situation worse, he starts praising Donald Trump. Yes, you heard that right. The very same Trump that the Labour Party has criticised for years. It feels like Starmer is trying to rewrite the party's entire foreign policy in a single night. But what could be his motivation? He begins discussing Trump, and instead of taking a professional approach or criticising him like his predecessors, he lauds his role in Gaza. This is the same Trump who has become a nightmare for international relations, yet Starmer acts as if he's some sort of peacemaker. What was he thinking? Did he genuinely believe this would portray him as a diplomatic genius? In reality, it had the opposite effect. Labour supporters are outraged, feeling that Starmer has completely forgotten the party's core values. Share your thoughts in the comments, and see you later.